Final ending of the drop, part 1 down below. As they slept together, they occasionally reached out to touch each other's bodies. Pressed against one another, they reveled in the heat of each other's bodies. Their body perspiration blended together to form a single, glistening layer that shrouded them both. They made love side by side after a time when their bodies began to move in unison. She apologized to Kyle, very softly. She was resisting the urge to sleep for the moment, but she was giving in little by little. After the passionate kiss, Peggy's body was close to his, her head resting on his shoulder. Her fingertips lightly caressed his chest. The hairs on his chest stood on end from her heated breath. She regretfully added, "I know I act like a bee sometimes, but I don't mean to." This was the most at ease and carefree she'd felt around him in a long time. His tone was purposefully soft and conciliatory as he whispered, "Peggy, we've got to get on with things. The kids, our life. We've been stuck on this one small thing for way too long, baby." With an unhappy tone, she responded, "I know," matching Kyle's low voice. For a time, she stirred restlessly, but then she calmed down and rested her full body on his. "I just can't get the picture of you enjoying Anne out of my mind. And it hurts, Kyle. It makes me crazy to think of you and her doing that." Now, her voice was pleading. She was pleading for forgiveness. Kyle made an attempt to give it to her. "Honey," he replied, "I can see that. It would kill me if you were to go do that to Paul the next party we go to. But I didn't mean to do it, baby. I couldn't deliberately do something like that to you. I never will." He was unsure if his words to her had the intended impact. They slept at such for the remainder of the night, her not moving. However, she did not show that she was ready to forget or forgive. The following morning, he concluded that what they had was a truce rather than peace. One calm set morning at the end of August, Kyle made the decision to do all in his power to thwart any possibility of Peggy engaging in willful adultery. After weighing his options, he decided to go forward since he knew he would never be able to forgive such a calculated, heartless act of deception. He had already moved to put up a barrier while she was considering an out-of-town tryst. He had used some maneuvering to prevent her from attending a training conference in Chicago, but he hadn't made it his mission to persuade her that she didn't need to break her vows. He had not, until now. He didn't understand he would do virtually anything to keep his family together until he saw Mandy and Todd having fun in a sandbox at the park. It was okay if it required a lot more work than he should have had to do. He was unaware of any rule requiring Peggy to meet him halfway, so be it if it meant going further than normal. To maintain himself, Peggy, Mandy, and Todd together as a family, he would put in as much effort and as much time as possible. He had previously attempted. He would now put forth much more effort. At the park, Peggy wasn't among them. She was putting in extra hours at her downtown office to finish writing the report and auditing a high-profile account. That's where she was and that's what she was doing, he was positive. She had to work on set for the third time in a row. It was becoming old. He thought of something. The two in the sandbox leaped up and ran to their father, who had been sitting and observing them from the park bench, saying, "Kids, hey, come here a minute." Since they had been playing for a while, they were probably getting a little bored with what they were doing. They were all set for a change, as if he were talking to them in secret about something others shouldn't know about. Kyle leaned over to put his face level with theirs and talked loudly enough for them to hear. They drew nearer together. Kyle wrapped them in his arms. "What say you? We get all cleaned up and go get a big all pizza," he said, but two happy children cut him off. There was more joyful dancing and yelling. "And we take our pizza and go see Mommy." In a matter of moments, the plan was approved, passed, and put into action. Upon entering Peggy's office at lunch, the trio was met with weary smiles by a disgruntled group of accountants. Having built on his previous suggestion, Kyle had brought enough pizza and soft drinks for everyone. When it became apparent what he had done, the whole team flocked around with great enthusiasm, rubbing friendly shoulders with one another while they tussled playfully over who would get to eat the most pies. In a matter of seconds, the office morale substantially improved. When the young boy and girl gave their mother Hallmark cards expressing how much they missed her, their expressions softened even more and a warm, joyful atmosphere permeated the room. 30 minutes later, Kyle collected them up. Each child had received numerous hugs and had sat on several laps, enthusiastically tapping keyboards to see what would happen on the monitor screens. For some reason, Mandy was particularly enthralled with the Windows Solitaire game. The office was filled with grins until late in the evening after everyone left. They made a strong effort to complete the job. Peggy was praised by all for having such a wonderful husband and family. A few single women inquired as to if Kyle had an available brother. Kyle, who was already sensitive to this kind of thing, doubled up to make sure Peggy never got a chance to find a partner and exact her retribution. It was a decade of months. He had assumed that by now she would have put it out of her mind, but she hadn't. Imagined it as a festering sore in her head, and he was trying everything he could to bandage it, hoping a crust would form and then fall off. He started showing up to her office at strange hours. Every now and again it was to take her to lunch. He once brought in brown bag lunches and sat at her desk with her, laughing and conversing with passers-by on a few occasions. Sometimes he would surprise her by picking her up at work, take her to a performance or something, and then dropping her off at home. Occasionally, a heartfelt card would be brought to her workplace accompanied with a bouquet of flowers or a dozen roses. A florist decorated her cubicle with streamers, potted plants, fruit baskets, and flowers for her birthday. Observing this, a newly arrived office Lothario who had been relocated from the southeast suburb office quickly abandoned his initial interest in Peggy as a target. The third story made much easy pickings up. The married women at work started using Kyle as a yardstick for evaluating their own spouses. They insisted that their men give them the same consideration. When his name was called, all the girls grinned and complimented Peggy on her good fortune in finding such a nice man. Few observed the pinching of her features that occurred when they uttered that. Few others witnessed the look of annoyance that crossed her face occasionally when Kyle showed up out of the blue at her office. They didn't know why, but many saw that over time, she became less happy every time candies or flowers appeared out of the blue. They pondered the reason behind this. Nobody was aware of Kyle's error from so many months ago. Peggy never expressed her feelings to anyone. She believed that no one was going to listen to her side of the story. "Hi, Mom," Peggy greeted her mother. She called her mother on Thursday night as usual to see how things were going. "Hi, hon," her mother answered. "What's up? Have you gotten Kyle to understand yet what he did to you?" "No," Peggy whispered. "I don't think he ever will." Denise said, "Horse manure." In response, "You have to stand up to him, Peggy. It's just not an option and you know it." "But, Mom, I never get a chance to find some guy out there to have a little fling with. Kyle is always popping up wherever I am, at work, the tennis club. Any day now, I expect to find him in the shower at the gym. I just can't get any distance from him to make things happen." Her mother made a few sympathetic sounds. She questioned in a doubtful manner, "There's nobody at work." Peggy gave a snort. "He's got every woman in that place wrapped around his little finger," Peggy said. "One of the men will be on the phone, quickly calling my beloved spouse, if I so much as grin at him. Heck, before I can greet the person, he'll probably be standing behind me." For a while, Denise made pitying comments about her husband smothering her daughter and bemoaned the fact that he had managed to win over everyone in the company to his cause, but she was at a loss as to how to undo what had already been done. "All right, honey." Denise tapped the mouthpiece with a long fingernail and said, "Let's see." It was something her mother did that really irritated Peggy, but she never said anything. "I suppose you'll have to let go of the notion of a little flirtation then," Denise replied, glumly. Denise's mind drew back from picturing what she was actually encouraging her daughter to do. Neither Peggy nor her mother cared to investigate the fact that the euphemism they kept using stood for an intensely intimate physical act with some faceless man. Neither woman thought of it as bonding, not deep in their hearts. They knew it intellectually, but they didn't feel it. It was just a way to get some retribution for the nasty business Kyle had so far gotten away with. "That's my girl," Denise joyfully answered. "You can't allow him to treat you like the tyrant he has been. It's him who deserves to be sad, not you. He must experience some of what you have been experiencing." The giant fire truck was approaching, its siren wail growing louder and louder until the down Doppler caused the noise to rise in pitch. A shrill scream that pierced the house walls and even the bodies of the people inside, a universe unto itself for a long eternity of a few seconds. The truck passed, and then came the smaller sirens of an ambulance and a rescue wagon, the down Doppler causing the noise to immediately drop in pitch and volume as soon as the emergency vehicles began to move down the street. "Whoa," Denise gasped. "I thought that truck was in your bedroom for a split second." She briefly laughed. "Yes, it was loud, and I'm here to tell you," Peggy informed her mother, laughing. "Hell, I was wondering if it was coming in the window or something." "Where had we been, then?" Denise inquired. Peggy reminded her mother, "We were talking about me needing to find a way to get a little of my own back at my dear husband." "Yes, that's correct," Denise replied. "Listen, honey, if you'd like, I'm sure your father's and my country clubs are full of men in the Hidden Hills. I could introduce you if you came along for a quick visit out there one afternoon." "No, Mom," Peggy retorted. "Years ago, I told Kyle how much I detested that area with all the stuffed shirts and whatnot. If I told him abruptly that I was going to go outside, he would know something was wrong." Denise answered sadly, "Yeah, I get it." She was silent in a tiny room. "You know, I simply don't understand why Kyle won't acknowledge that he made a mistake by allowing Anne to act in that way and realize that you deserve some sort of retribution. He ought to understand that it's the most natural thing ever. It just doesn't make sense," she remarked angrily. "I know," Peggy answered, "but he doesn't seem to be willing to give me any peace of mind. He acts as though he owns my body." The deep, manly voice continued, "You can have all the peace you want." When the fire truck was at its loudest, Kyle had seen that there was an extension in the den where he could make a phone call. Neither of the women had heard the line snap amid the commotion. Both Peggy and Denise were startled into a brief hush. Peggy cried out into the phone, "Kyle." She was on the verge of tears. An infernal rage had flared up in an instant. "Stop talking on the phone. You have no right to listen in on my conversations with my mother, for crying out loud. I won't take this bullshit from you, you bastard." "I wasn't spying on you, Peggy," Kyle said coolly. "I picked up the phone to ask Fred if he wanted to play golf tomorrow, and that's when I heard about what you and your mother were planning." But, dear, some people need to be spied on because their husbands can't continue to trust them. Peggy let go of the phone and let out a long, incoherent scream. Denise heard it somewhat over the phone line, and Kyle could hear it all the way downstairs. Denise yelled, "You son of a," with malice. "Who the hell do you think you are? You can't talk to us that way. You have no right to talk to me and my daughter like that." Kyle intervened. With a harsh tone in his voice, Kyle responded, "I will speak to my wife any way I damned well please, Denise. It's no business of yours how I talk to her, and I'd appreciate it if you butted out of our problems. You don't have any right to be putting yourself between me and my wife, and it's time for you to stop." Denise spat at her son-in-law, saying, "You listen to me, you pig." She had to pause and inhale deeply to calm herself since she was so furious. Her hands were shaking from rage. "No, Denise, you listen to me," Kyle snapped back. "Denise, if your daughter follows through on what she's been trying to accomplish for the past 8 or 9 months, she will lose everything she loves. She will lose me, her kids, her friends, her respect from employers and coworkers. She will lose it all. And if I discover that you assisted her in any way, I will sue you for every penny that you and Dan possess. Is that clear? I'm not sure for what, but I'm sure Brad Carson will find something. Do you hear me?" He didn't wait for an answer, slamming the phone down hard before she could get a word out. His voice rose as he spoke, his wrath growing the longer he thought about what he'd heard his mother-in-law offer to his wife. He had walked out the front door while Peggy was still trying to gather herself enough to come downstairs, so he thought the first call would be from her, but the screen said it was his father-in-law. His first impulse was to refuse the call, then he punched the accept button. There wouldn't be a better time to talk to Dan, he might as well get it over with. 20 minutes later, while he was still walking around the block in an attempt to cool off before he went back home to confront Peggy, his cell phone rang. "Kyle." When Kyle remained silent, Dan growled, "Just what the heck do you mean shouting at my wife and threatening her? In any case, what the Sam Hill is going on here?" At the end, he sounded a little confused. "I'll break it down for you, Dan. This is it," Kyle stated coolly. "I heard your wife say that she will find a stud at your country club to service Peggy so she can get even with me for that goddamn mistake I made last Valentine's Day," Kyle said. "What?" Dan uttered a feeble sentence as he tried to comprehend what Kyle was saying. "Imagine listening to your mother-in-law imply that she would be happy to pimp her own daughter to the men at your country club." "That's exactly what I thought, Dan," Kyle angrily told him. "Is that something you can envision? How stupid of a thing to do." It was a weak rebuttal, and both men knew it. Kyle had no idea what was going on at the other end of the line and would have been encouraged if he had. "Now, I don't think there's a call to talk like that, Kyle," Dan said slowly. "Pumping out her daughter is a harsh thing to accuse my wife of doing, man." Actually, his father-in-law had just turned to glare at his wife. Denise, stunned at the anger in her husband's eyes, returned the glare for a long moment, but she could not hold it. It wasn't until Dan turned to face her that Denise realized what she'd said to her daughter could, or would, be interpreted that way. She hadn't realized she'd crossed the line when she made the remark about the men at the club. It was just a casual suggestion, and she hadn't thought about it before. Suddenly, she realized she'd crossed the line. In actuality, it's a little worse than that. "I think you need to consider the implications in what she said, Dad," Kyle remarked with dismay. "Like what, exactly?" Dan came back shortly. His initial outrage at Kyle had taken a different turn. "All right, Dan, consider it this way. That implies Denise is of the opinion that cheating on one's husband is a correct response in at least some circumstances." "Dan," Kyle remarked, "your wife was encouraging Peggy to commit adultery. If I were you, I think that would give me a little pause." After a lengthy moment of silence during which he considered what Kyle had said, his father-in-law's glowering frown turned into something considerably more indifferent and ruthless as he stared at his wife's pale face. With a restrained tone, Dan replied, "Yeah, I see what you mean, son. Sometimes, my daughter takes after her mother too much." Kyle, as he silently gazed at the wife he had married. "I blame myself for some of that," he thought. "She was the baby of the family, and she was born at one of the busiest times in my life, and I just didn't have enough hours in a day to make sure her mom didn't indoctrinate her with some of the most screwball ideas you ever heard," Dan said. Denise let out an outraged cry, which made Kyle nearly smile. It was the first funny thing he'd heard in a long time. Dan added gently, "Kyle, I apologize for becoming furious at you. I also apologize on behalf of my smart-ass wife who keeps getting in the way." Kyle could hear a second gasp in the distance. "Son, I can assure you that my wife won't be meddling in your or Peggy's troubles anymore." Dan remarked, "I have to go now, as long as she's my wife, that is. Kyle, there are a few things I need to sort out at my home. I hope you have luck, okay?" "Yes, Dad," Kyle answered. "Hear me out. Good luck to you too." The phone died. Dan gave his wife a threatening glance from across town. "Denise," he began in a voice that was almost audible. "How long have we been married?" 34 years, hesitantly answered Denise. "Are you in favor of our reaching 35? Dan gave a growl. Upon returning home, Peggy was eerily quiet when Kyle arrived. She had called her mother back when the line wasn't busy, receiving a truncated version of what Dan and Kyle had discussed. Denise informed Peggy that her father was more irate than she had ever seen him. He had gone for a drive, warning his wife to be home when he returned. He had informed Denise that upon his return, she had better get ready to reach a better understanding with him regarding her beliefs regarding women's interactions with men, her relationship with her daughter and Kyle, and particularly regarding marriage and how theirs should develop going forward. The television was turned down, so neither adult could have seen what was on, and after dinner, with their house looking more like an armed camp than a happy home, Kyle and Peggy sat in the living room pretending to feel affection while playing with the kids. The phone rang after the kids were reluctantly put to bed. Denise's job was to tell Peggy that she was sorry for even considering pairing her daughter with one of the men at the Hidden Hills Club. It was wrong, she said, and she sincerely hoped that Peggy understood that and would never do any of the things she'd mentioned. Peggy was so stunned that she remained mute for the majority of the talk, mostly speaking in monosyllables, and when her mother requested her to hand Kyle the phone, she did so silently. Kyle was brief, acknowledging Denise's admissions of guilt without adding more than a simple acknowledgement before hanging up and not returning the call to his wife. His mother-in-law sounded remorseful, clearly regretting what she'd said to her daughter, and Denise was reserved and a little emotional, obviously having to force words out through a lump in her throat a few times. But Denise had made a choice, that much was clear, and Kyle wished them all the luck possible. That's the last time, Peggy began, and Kyle remarked quietly. She was still processing her mother's warnings. She had never heard her cry so much. Her mother told Peggy that she couldn't survive without her husband and that she should sort things out with Kyle before it was too late. Peggy wasn't sure how to respond to this sudden shift in her mother's advice. Was it something that would last until the firestorm passed? Distracted, Peggy blurted out, "What? That's the last time I'm going to try to keep you from making the biggest mistake in your life," stated Kyle. "I am tired of you creeping around, your plans, and your damned arguments that you deserve to sleep some guy because of 30 seconds of a good time I unintentionally had almost a year ago. I'm full up to here," he said, measuring a place on his neck with his palm. Kyle stared at his wife, as if she were a stranger he would have to explain later, for a long moment. Neither of them said anything. Finally, Peggy remarked, her defiance subdued but unwavering, "I'm not going to make a mistake. All that's in your mind." Kyle snorted, knowing what spin control sounded like. With a sarcastic "That's good, Peggy," he leaned closer and lowered his voice to make her pay attention. "Because we will, if you ever do. Are through. Do you get that? If you ever go out on purpose and have slept with another man, we are done." Peggy gave him a bitter glance. "You know, like when you were with Anne." With a challenge, she queried, and Kyle shook his head. "Don't even begin. It's untrue, as you know. Anne and I made an inadvertent mistake. We both stopped as soon as we realized the other person wasn't who we thought they were. That's all there was to it. It was a bad, very regrettable error, but it was a mistake. What you're trying to do is a whole different ballgame, and you know it." He grumbled. He was really sick of this. They'd been over it so many times. Peggy gave a head shake. He observed that she was unwilling to consider Kyle and Anne's innocence, possibly even incapable of doing so. Knowing what the defiant look on Peggy's face meant, Kyle told her, "Well, you better find some way to live with it then. I mean it. If you cheat on me, I'll kick your butt out so fast your head will spin, woman." Her spouse could see she didn't believe it by the expression in her eyes. Her jawline revealed her disobedient nature. With a groan, he retired to bed. He could see the train catastrophe coming, but it appeared there was nothing he could do about it. The months-long cold spell persisted. Their health had been getting better. He directed all of his excess energy toward ensuring that his kids were unaware of the conflict he and Peggy were experiencing. He wasn't always as successful as he was. He and Peggy appeared to be accidental roommates at the same boarding house, despite their already estranged relationship. He grew closer to his kid and young girl, taking solace in their love from the hatred emanating from his wife. He worked on enhancing Todd's social skills and table etiquette while also teaching him how to tie his shoelaces. Toddy had undoubtedly picked up the notion that it was hilarious to burp at strange times from daycare. It was difficult to persuade him otherwise. It was Mandy's second growth spurt. The thicker legs of a child were becoming thinner ones, the limbs of a young lady. Now she was in elementary school. Throughout the winter and early spring, he had worked with Mandy, gently teaching her to read material that was well beyond the grasp of a typical 6-year-old. When she realized she understood what the pages were trying to tell her, she joyfully hugged her father and spent many an hour sounding out words on his lap. Todd participated in his sister's and father's small celebrations despite having little idea of what they were doing and taking pleasure in his sister's and father's warmth. One day, Kyle was sitting on the couch and Mandy was going through a new reader, and he found himself standing at his father's shoulder. As Todd started pointing out phrases he knew, the three of them became closer. Peggy was resentful as she watched, but she didn't want to get closer to her husband in order to have fresh intimacy with her children. She became increasingly aloof, less inclined to make concessions, and even more confident in the certainty that she would eventually have to face up to Kyle's adultery. Suddenly, 15 months after the gathering at which he and Anne had a chance encounter, Peggy's demeanor softened somewhat. Even though there was noticeably less making love than before, the bonding continued, and it was still greater than what he had been receiving. Little steps, he reminded himself. Accept what you got and strive for even greater affection and kindness. Peggy informed him that the training she had previously been booked for was on once more a few weeks later. He would be to Orlando for her. Alone, she said with a rather careless tone, to receive the training that would eventually position her for a raise in salary and a better position. She stated that it would be for a week at the end of July. She exuded energy and innocence. She made a concerted effort to convey that this was a positive development. Nothing to worry about for him. Kyle realized that this was it. What's the duration of your knowledge? He inquired dully. Peggy withdrew. Her demeanor slightly grew icier. The announcement came down from the personnel office 2 days ago, she explained. Keeping an eye on his eyes, she tried to predict his reaction to the news. It wasn't a falsehood that she told him when she said the documentation had actually been sent to her. However, she had been collaborating with the people who planned the program for a month. She had not been surprised by it. Kyle questioned, and you're going at the end of next month? Peggy gave a nod. Well, sounds like the powers that be have given you plenty of notice this time, he said. She had waited 2 days to tell him, but he didn't inquire why. Perhaps it was because of the way he'd cut short her last vacation. She might still find that offensive. Perhaps, but something more was apparent to him from the flame that was hidden deep in her hooded eyes. As she cheerfully skipped up the stairs, Kyle watched. She was planning the clothes she would bring with her and was going to start getting ready now. She was giddy with anticipation. Weary, Kyle shook his head. He didn't care anymore, so he hadn't questioned Peggy about the wait for her to tell him. She emerged from the shower, steaming hot, and came to him. While they both recovered, she turned onto her back and watched her husband sit on the edge of the bed with a hint of resentment. She said, "You sure had to work hard for that one." She noticed her spouse tensing up. He opened his mouth, then held it. He spent a long while fighting with himself. "Yeah," he continued, "you know, it's easier when there are 2 people having sex than when there's just one." Peggy became enraged at once. She yelled, "What the hell do you mean by that?" Kyle did not pay attention. Reaching down to retrieve his pajama bottoms, he entered the adjoining bathroom. He was saddened by the loss of something that would never come back, even while he was also upset that a significant turning point in their marriage had been passed. As he watched his wife finish her coffee, he asked, "Peggy?" She said, "Yeah, hon," as she went to the sink to rinse the cup. Peggy always kept things neat. A cup was placed next to the other cups on the top level of the dishwasher. "You remember the time right after I caught your mother and you on the phone and she was talking about the men at the Hidden Hills Club?" Peggy felt anxious. She didn't want Kyle's thoughts to be focused on this morning. She hoped that this conversation would also end quickly. "I remember, Kyle, but that's ancient history now, honey. Mom apologized and everything. It's over and done with," she said. Kyle said, "No, that's not what I meant. When that happened, I told you I'd never try again to prevent you from carrying out your revenge." Peggy turned to look at him, unsure of what would happen next. She had a clear conscience. Since then, she had taken care to avoid raising any concerns in Kyle's mind. Her mouth clenched. She hadn't done anything improper this time. She awaited her husband's next move. "Well, I lied," Kyle said. Peggy fluttered. That was one of the last things she could have imagined hearing. "What?" she exclaimed, seeming perplexed. He said to her, "I lied. I am going to try one last time, Peggy. I know what you are planning, honey. I know what you're going to do in Orlando," he remarked with a smile. Leaning heavily against the countertop, Peggy placed it at her back. She hurriedly went over everything she'd said to anyone, every phone call she'd made, and every email or letter she'd sent or received regarding the trip to Orlando. In actuality, nothing she had said or done remotely suggested that she might be unfaithful. Suddenly, she became furious. "Damn it, Kyle," she grumbled. "I am not planning anything. I gave up on that. I told you so months ago. I didn't believe you when you said it, Peggy, and I don't believe it now," Kyle stated plainly. "You don't have it in you to forgive me and let things go." "I know you too well," he said. Peggy's mouth drew straighter lips. "Peggy, I'm begging you, please don't do this thing, baby," begged Kyle. "Just don't do it. That's all you have to do. I'll live without bonding. I'll get along without the loving. You don't have to even be nice to me. Just don't break up the family. Please, Peggy, for Mandy and Todd." Peggy gave him a prolonged glance. She had a slight look of uncertainty on her face. She opened her mouth. A stentorian blast from the street outside silenced everything she might have meant to say. Her cab was standing here. Kyle made a tearful plea, but neither she nor he ever responded. She greeted him with a kiss at the door, giving him a tender touch on the chest, and trailed the driver to the large yellow automobile. When the taxi moved away from the curb, she waved through the side window. At the corner, Kyle saw the car turn left and slowly disappear from view. He sighed deeply to himself and closed the door. He took his phone out of the belt-mounted leather case. "Brad," he exclaimed upon making the connection. "Hey, buddy," Brad answered. His voice was not that of an attorney-client. Kyle, his friend, was in pain, and not much could be done to help. Kyle stated, "She simply left." "All right, number 42, Brad stated in a dejected manner. "Jimmy is already at the airport. I'll call him and get the ball rolling, and then we shall see what we shall see, okay? Yes, a sorrowful Kyle replied. Thanks, Brad. I'll talk to you later. Bye, Brad uttered quickly. Nothing else could be said. Over the last few weeks, there had been 6 in-person sessions where the key topics had been discussed. Peggy was rescheduled for the training seminar ever since she disregarded the material. The unremarkable small man was typical in every aspect. His attire was simple, neither very trendy nor too out of style to draw attention. There was nothing in his figure, his stance, or his features that would draw attention. He was practically invisible as he moved around the suitcase carousel. Despite holding a baggage claim ticket in his hand and anxiously watching for the next bag to emerge off the conveyor belt, it appeared that he was searching in vain for a suitcase. He gave the impression of a man stuck in an office job with no real prospects beyond winning a gold watch at the conclusion of a protracted period of dismal days and years. Still, he had come to terms with it. He stopped fighting the boredom. He'd given up and accepted it ages ago. But that wasn't his true nature. Jimmy was his name. He was an excellent private investigator. He had just arrived in Orlando via American Airlines. Kyle's lawyer, Brad Carson, had previously employed him for specific tasks. When Kyle mentioned gathering enough evidence against Peggy to give him a realistic chance of obtaining custody of the kids in a divorce settlement, he immediately thought of Jimmy. Brad was aware that the likelihood of that happening was slim, but he reasoned that if Peggy had enough embarrassing pictures and videos, she might not challenge the divorce and keep the pictures and move as private. One friend to another, he and Kyle had a lengthy and intense conversation about it. Brad was aware that it was immoral, but certain things have no moral boundaries. Brad would go to any lengths for his closest friend, number 42, and he would do everything for him. Jimmy had been watching Peggy Whitley since she arrived at the airport at home, and he continued to observe her surreptitiously while she picked up her bags here in Orlando. It was simple to complete. Mrs. Whitley didn't even appear to have thought about who might be observing her. With all the attention the woman gave him, Jimmy may as well have been one of the wheeled luggage carriers in the rack. Everyone turned to look at the tall, middle-aged man who had just burst through the outside entrance. People no longer overlook loud noises after 9/11. Most of them lost interest when they realized he wasn't a young, Middle Eastern man wearing a heavy vest and holding an automatic rifle. However, other people kept staring at him, perplexed as to why he had caused the first disturbance. Jimmy followed him since he had suspicions about the newcomer. The man had searched wildly before spotting Peggy Whitley and heading straight for her. They gave each other an embrace. A bit uncomfortably, Jimmy thought, as though they were still getting used to one another and figuring out how their various pieces fit together. It was nevertheless intimate contact with a man who was not her spouse, a physical contact that Peggy was not authorized to be having. The briefing the lawyer had given him had made that much plain. He took his phone out of his sport coat pocket and dialed the number. He took pictures of the man and Peggy chatting amiably while he feigned to look for his bags. The gap between the two grew less throughout the course of the following 10 minutes. They started an age-old dance that would ultimately have only one potential conclusion: careful strokes, tentative caresses, and touches on the hips and thighs. Jimmy trailed behind them into the parking garage, seemingly finding it difficult to manage the 2 hefty luggage, laptop, and 1 clothing bag. The 2 he was trailing failed to see the completely normal man who staggered along in their wake. When they got to a dark blue Lincoln parked on the 4th floor, he stopped following them. He took a picture with the pricey but minuscule camera concealed in his hand as he passed by. The tiny camera had high-resolution digital images that could be downloaded to the laptop and sent home to the lawyer he knew via any broadband connection. He managed to capture 2 clear images of Mrs. Whitley giving the unidentified man increasingly affectionate kisses. The 3 images of the car license plate would guarantee that the man's identity wouldn't stay a mystery for very long. Jimmy had no trouble making reservations for the room next to Peggy's since Mr. Whitley had given him her reservation details. All that was necessary was the corner of a $100 bill sticking out of a Sports Illustrated magazine. Jimmy went to get to the elevators, but the magazine stayed on the counter at the registration desk. Before a buddy of a friend who knew someone knocked on his door, he had time to unpack his belongings and take a sleep. His reserve had come in. Jimmy could have handled the case on his own, but he knew he would need certain sophisticated equipment that he would not have been able to bring onto the plane without drawing suspicion and having to explain himself in great detail. Jimmy was taken aback to see that his helper was a woman, although a quite lovely one. Cassie was her name, and she had been an investigator for 3 years. As they descended to a side exit and took out a solid pole that had been split into sections from Cassie's car, she and Jimmy engaged in amiable conversation. Once it was put together, he and Cassie could reach up to 18 feet across a gap to use a small digital camera or a microphone attached to the end to give the camera a better angle, say, between 2 balconies of a high-rise hotel. It was a nocturnal surveillance device exclusively. In the daytime, the people in the room would notice. The details that Cassie's acquaintance had discovered through a completely illegitimate license plate check were brought with her. Harold Lowery was the friend that Peggy had made. He was employed by the company holding the training session as a mid-level executive. The exact date of his first encounter with Peggy was still unknown, but after a few days of work, it would become clear. Jimmy knew for sure. These days, everything that is done leaves a paper trail. They would learn everything there was to know about Mr. Lowry in a day or two. Jimmy and Cassie had information from the target's spouse that indicated Peggy would be occupied at the training facility until dinner time. When she returned to the hotel to change into new clothes, they intended to start monitoring her. The two private detectives got along well nearly right away and even spelled each other out. One slept, the other listening for Peggy's return. When the time came, they would be prepared for a long evening, one that appeared certain to be vile. They both disliked cases of cheating spouses, but they had to pay the bills. The client would receive what he requested from the two representatives. When Peggy's plane arrived from Orlando, she was a little miffed that Kyle wasn't there to greet her. But on the way home in the taxi, she gave it some thinking and concluded that it was probably all for the best. Strange memories from the previous week started popping into her head, and she couldn't help but smile with delight at the memories. Best if Kyle never saw their smiles. He would be wary. For once, Peggy felt content with who she was. Oh my, approximately 1.5 years. She had felt the need to exact revenge on her husband ever after she'd learned about their encounter at the party from her Kyle and Anne. For a moment, she'd thought about getting even with Anne, but she still hadn't figured out how. Peggy hadn't given up on the notion, it was only waiting for the right moment. But at last, she'd exacted her retribution on Kyle. Did she ever? A grin crossed Peggy's face. She was smiling to herself, too. She received a smile in return from the cabbie. All right, lesson acquired. Peggy realized she would need to keep a closer eye on herself. She didn't realize how hard it would be to hold on to this beautiful tiny ball of contented happiness inside of her. Now that she knew how simple it was to let things slide, it was best for her to address her behavior. She had succeeded in getting him. She had managed to get Kyle. True. Excellent. That knowledge thrilled her. It had taken a very long time, but it was finished now. Kyle had extramarital affairs. Peggy had to now as well. Peggy had made a wise decision on her course of action this time. She had not made any plans that she could be aware of. The man she had met in Orlando, Harold, was employed at the regional center of his organization, and she would have naturally made touch with him when setting up the training. They have only had a few meetings to discuss their respective roles in the commercial dealings between their two companies. All but one of those had occurred prior to Anne and Kyle's problems even beginning. Just a few times after the training was set, she'd given him a call on a payphone, just frequently enough to suggest to Harold that she would like to meet up with him when she descended. She felt that making the call to Harold from the aircraft was a brilliant move. It had been successful. Harold virtually burst with excitement when he arrived at the airport. Naturally, the credit card Kyle was unaware of was charged for the expense of the call. He had told her so venomously that he would notice any charges she made to the couple's credit cards, so she had made arrangements for that. Once more, she grinned to herself. Admit it, she performed well. This time, she had everything figured out. She nearly burst out laughing. She truly was going to have to see it, damn it. She wished Harold had been more comfortable in bed. Now, she believed she could have chosen her vengeance weapon more wisely. For example, there was that guy in the same training course as her. His home state was Arizona. Randy, that was his name. There was a man now. In his fitted business suit, he had looked ravishing. She couldn't help but think how Randy would have appeared next to her bed. She was curious about his size. That bulge in his trousers from the first night in the smoker when that Terry woman had looked up at him. It had been impressive to witness. Peggy realized all of a sudden that this would not be her final experience. She gave the concept some thought. She would make sure Kyle never found out, and even if he did, it wouldn't harm him. How is that possible? She continued to consider it for some time. She would take extreme caution. She would never arrange elaborate preparations to meet a man. Someone like Randy would always have to be involved. Someone she happened to meet while traveling and not at home. Yes, that was the plan. Chance meetings in locations Kyle would never, ever be. Because he would never see any indications of cheating that would expose her, he also never had any suspicions. She made up her mind to never have a long-term relationship. She didn't need to be connected with another man. They were too complex and entangled. Kyle was more than sufficient. Peggy sat on the hot seat in the backseat of the cab and made a tiny circle with her lower body. Abruptly, she pondered when she would be going out of town again. She was curious about who she would run into and find to play with there. Yes, that's how she would describe it in her own words. It was in motion. It was not a severe matter. What she wanted to know was how the mail would taste, smell, and appear. Her mobile phone rang. "Hello," she exclaimed with joy. "Mrs. Whiteley, it's Sam McMillan here." "Hi, Sam, how are you today?" Even though Peggy didn't like her employer, she could live with him for the day. "Quite well," Mr. McMillan replied. He didn't inquire about her well-being. "I'm going to get right to the point, Mrs. Whiteley," he replied. His tone was full of humor. It was there, but only as a trace. She was able to hear it. "All right," Peggy said inquisitively. "All well, then, Mrs. Whiteley, this is it," he stated. "You are being notified that your job at Bruck & Son is being terminated with cause, as per my request." I am notified by Mr. Bruck Jr. that you are welcome to visit the business offices on Monday morning in order to pick up your severance check and arrange your desk anytime between 9 and 12 noon. Additionally, Mr. Bruck stated that any queries you may have will be addressed at that time. Peggy, thunderstruck, allowed a long stillness to develop. The cabbie observed the sad look appear on Peggy's lovely face. The driver observed the woman closely for some time because of the sudden change in her demeanor. He'd had a number of unpleasant encounters with individuals whose demeanor suddenly soured in his back seat. Then he sensed that this fare would not leave him with much of a tip. He looked back at the roadway ahead clumsily. I am not sure I get it, Peggy eventually coughed out. Why, that was the only thing that crossed her thoughts. Mr. McMillan answered, Mrs. Whiteley, I'm not sure. His tone carried a hint of sincerity. Peggy concluded he probably didn't know, but he wasn't even slightly disappointed that she wasn't in his section. She took a big breath and released her hand from her mouth. She picked up the phone again when she was ready. It's okay, she said to her former manager. So I guess I'll simply have to wait till Monday. I appreciate you calling, she murmured. She didn't wait for his response before pressing the button to disconnect. That last shred of control over him, that tiny satisfaction, was all she had. When the taxi pulled up to the curb, Kyle's big pickup wasn't in the driveway. Peggy felt displeased. Her spouse ought to be present. Now, his was her sole comfort. He would not give a damn why she'd been let go. He would reassure her and show her love. She felt something else was up with her day the moment she went through the front door. Gone was the grandfather's clock, which had been perched on the lengthy wall in the foyer ever since they had moved into the house. There was also no umbrella stand in the corner. She entered the living room, which was empty except for a few stray pieces of brown wrapping paper. There was silence in the house. Something sent shivers down her spine. The house seemed deserted, void. Her mobile phone rang once more. She examined the screen. It was Kyle. Kyle, she angrily said. How are you doing? All of the furnishings is missing. Oh my God, what's happening? As she spoke, her voice became higher. She felt hurt and furious, and a little afraid. She was unaware of what was going on. Calmly, Kyle said, I won't tell you where I am, Peggy. He sounded worn out, almost too worn out to talk. In actuality, he was struggling with a strong sense of exhaustion. It was partially corporeal. It had been a long haul packing and loading a house full of furniture and personal belongings into a large U-Haul truck. It had been surprisingly easy to deal with telling the kids, but dealing with his own inner turmoil had been emotionally taxing. This was a talk he had been dreading, but he had to have it. Ever since Brad had shown him the early photos of Peggy's antics on her first night in Orlando, he had scarcely slept. After watching the DVD of her active time on the balcony, he'd been unable to close his eyes. That had arrived yesterday morning on Friday. Brad's private investigator had access to a laptop that produced DVD-quality movies from the raw input of a digital camcorder. Using a broadband connection, the investigator had poured the movies and a ton of still images into Brad's workplace server. Now everything was safely tucked away in Kyle's briefcase, out of the reach of Peggy's kids. The kids and Kyle had already packed. For Kyle, the initial images and video had been more than sufficient. He and Brad had just gotten proof from Thursday night's frolic that they could use in court. The adulterous couple had been caught on camera in an environment where they had no right to anticipate privacy thanks to the camcorder's night vision capability. Given that Peggy and Harold had been in Peggy's room, the other images and videos could not be used as evidence in any court case. But the pictures and videos had other purposes for him. He just contacted Peggy on her cell when one of Brad's detectives called to let him know she had returned home. He had not waited for a moment of indolence to strike. This had to be ended, for him. If he got everything out of his system, perhaps he could sleep tonight. What? I want to know where you are, but you can't. Peggy made a demand. I didn't say I couldn't, Peg, Kyle calmly remarked. I said I wouldn't. Kyle palely. I have no idea what you're thinking about doing. However, you had best start informing me of what's happening, or I will. Going to what, Peggy? Kyle questioned acerbically. Have you not gotten it yet? I informed you. I've repeatedly told you that if you cheated on me in an attempt to get even with me, it was a ridiculous belief. Peggy, I promised to leave you. I've done as I mentioned to you. Peggy was taken aback. Among the several surprises that afternoon, this one was the most disastrous. She said in a weak voice, Kyle, honey, I haven't. Put it away, Peggy, Kyle remarked angrily. It's evident why I departed. Is there anything more to say? What? See what I mean? Peggy objected. I don't know what you're talking about. She didn't understand. Have you been in the den? Kyle inquired. No. Go there, said Kyle. With resentment, Peggy strolled along the brief hallway towards the rear of the residence, entering the spare bedroom that they had transformed into a study. She understood when she arrived. Over the fireplace, a massive blown-up image was resting on the mantel. It showed her and Harold out on the hotel balcony, but the colors were all washed out and it had a greenish tinge to it. She howled her delight to the moon while they were nude and running like beasts. Peggy fell to the ground. She would eventually lose support from her legs. With her legs tucked under her, she sat there. The image captivated her. It had her as thoroughly captivated as a rattlesnake on the verge of attack. She had a gut feeling that the picture signified the end of everything. Kyle, she murmured gruffly. Her mouth did not function properly. Kyle said, don't bother, Peggy. Do you see now? The house is empty, and now you know why. You see now why I'm not there with the kids, don't you? She yelled, where are my babies? She cried out, you can't take my babies away from me. Her tone sounded almost insane to Kyle. Peggy, calm down, he said. I have already deprived you of them. But it would be more accurate to state that you removed them from your own self. It has already taken place. I'll tell you how things will be and you'll have to learn to live with it, so take care of yourself. He had brought up the children, anticipating this response from his soon-to-be ex-wife, so he could let her know what he needed to say next. Peggy, Sandy and Todd are doing well, he informed her. He said, they're actually in better shape than I am. The idea that they would be living with me and that you wouldn't be around anymore wasn't too difficult for them to accept. Peggy, you've been so good at keeping them at bay for the past year that they weren't even bothered by the idea of not seeing you. I saw it coming, even though you didn't. No, Peggy sobbed. You can't do that. Simply put, I already did, Kyle replied. You did it already, he said. Now settle down and listen to what I'm going to tell you. He held out for a long time. He said, are you ready? Don't I have anything to say about this? Peggy spoke in a wounded manner. No, you don't, in response from Kyle. Peggy, for the first time in your life, all you can do is cope with the fallout from your actions. What you've done to your marriage, your husband, your kids, and yourself. Kyle inhaled deeply. Softly, it's too bad, Peggy, he remarked. You could have worked out practically anything with me if you hadn't been so consumed with getting even. Without a doubt, I was willing. But there is no other way you could have this. All you had to do was exact your revenge. And for what purpose? But you spent the better part of a year and a half working, conniving to figure out how to slip around and find a guy to sleep with. You did it, boy. I have footage and images of you fucking your friend Harold in every manner possible. Peggy, did you allow him to take you out onto the balcony? What on earth were you doing, allowing him to turn you over on the rail and let you sleep like that in front of anyone who happened to be peering out of their window? Do you realize that I have a video of the entire event? From beginning to end. Kyle came to a halt. Though he'd made a self-promise not to get furious, the fury was too present. He would need to exercise a little more self-control. Did you think I wouldn't know what you were going to do, Peggy? He replied softly. Oh God. For the past couple of weeks, you were virtually bursting with excitement. I was aware that there was just one item that would excite you to that extent. I could tell by everything you did, including the smiles you sent into space, that you were finally going to exact revenge on me. Peggy, it was so evident. Furthermore, Peggy, were you unaware that credit card firms send their clients adverts and special offers every few weeks? You mailed the bills to the post office box you believed I was unaware of. However, on occasion, they also send items to the residents using the account. Hell, woman, I was aware of that new credit card you received almost immediately after receiving it. He remained silent for a while. Kyle, Peggy murmured hesitantly. Honey, I was in error. All of it has collapsed upon me. This afternoon, I was let go. I'm not sure why. You know I harmed you, sweetie. I feel so foolish. Peggy, please stop referring to me as your baby, honey, and other such terms. You don't have the right to address me in that way. Not after your actions, Kyle retorted to her. He remained silent for a short while. I will agree with you though, you have been stupid, he continued. I attempted to convey to you the necessity to let go of your obsession with getting even. I made 100 attempts to inform you, but you refused to listen, he shouted angrily. You were required to get your way. And, Peggy, the reason you were fired is up on the mantle, he said. I forwarded the picture to Mr. Bruck. It appears that he shares my thoughts regarding workers who trick their husbands and take advantage of a work trip to have sex with unknown people. I see. Although it will read something else on the termination form, you were fired because they could no longer trust you. Not any more than mine. Peggy made an effort to process what Kyle was saying. It was just too much to process at once. She temporarily ignored the issue at work. Her marriage held significantly greater significance. Kyle, she uttered falteringly. You asked for my forgiveness when you and Ann made the error. Not able to you. Why can't we resolve this? Whatever it takes to make it up to you, I'll do it. Not able to pardon me. I really apologize for what I did to you. Her cheeks were wet with tears. Pardon, Peggy, I have nothing with which to show you forgiveness, Kyle said bluntly. You've exhausted me. Worn away, completely gone, every bit of affection I had for you. Not a thing remains. Peggy began to cry more intensely. The worn-out voice of Kyle carried a sense of finality. Sitting in the den, where she and Kyle had spent many an evening together, she felt suddenly terrified and cold. She cried, Don't you love me anymore? Yes, I do. A tiny bit, Peggy, Kyle said frank. Love is not something you give up on at the drop of a hat. Yeah, but I'll get it, he declared boldly. It's difficult, but Peggy, I will learn to stop loving you. How in the hell? Anyhow, this has been coming for a while. I'm so sick of you attempting to control me, the kids, and everyone else in your vicinity. Just to ensure that you would never have to offer more of yourself than you personally decided. I think I see your mother in that, Kyle remarked reflectively. Ever since Mandy's birth, Much more once Todd joined our family. Something has caught my attention. I'm not sure. He gave it another go. Perhaps it is comparable. It seems that you believed that your only obligation to me was to have a kid or children, and that after that, you had to lose all affection or regard for me as your spouse and a man. You seem to have been quite selective about your affections during the past few years, and I'm not sure why. Ever since the day I saw you on college, I have adored you. I'd be lost without you. With a quick reply, well, you're going to have to, Kyle said. I'm not sure how you become who you are, Peggy, but ever since that clothing incident, you've been acting as though our marriage was a fight you had to win at all costs ever since that awful outfit. It was even a contest for the dress. You lied to me in order to obtain what you had to have. Hell, you've been making up stories about various things ever since. Like I said, I think your mother has had some influence there, Peggy, he replied. We didn't just dispute over the clothing, but I know she thought I was unfair when I became upset about it. She has seized every occasion to jab another little prong into my flesh whenever she felt like it. You were the woman and I was the guy, therefore in her eyes, you had to come out on top in every argument we had. Kyle was quiet for some while. Anyway, I'm really tired, he remarked. I apologize for talking endlessly about subjects that are no longer important, he said to her. He firmly stated, let me get back to the kids, Peggy. To start with, I'm no longer in Texas. I will not be able to tell you where I will be working for a while because I will be out of state. Perhaps in the future. For a while, the TV stations can survive on their own. With these, I have things set up fairly well. I have given Brad the authority to handle any necessary actions with them. Oh, and they also don't know where I'll be, so don't even try asking down at my office. The children are doing well. They've been playing travel games and having a great time sitting up there in the cab of this large rental truck I'm driving. Everywhere we go, they declare that having a pool and a room free from bed linen and trash disposal is, as they put it this evening, awesome. Thus, Peggy, don't worry about them. I miss them, Peggy bitterly cried. Despite the coldness you've shown them over the past year, they'll still miss you, Kyle added with a seductive voice. However, some things are unavoidable. I'll fight you for them, Peggy proclaimed with a rebellious smile. You can't keep my children away from me. That takes us to the next item on the list, Kyle remarked sternly. He inhaled deeply. It was audible to Peggy over the phone. Peggy, I'm going to tell you this once, and only once. My divorce is going to be no fault. I'm suggesting that you get half of the wealth we've amassed together, but you won't get any money from the trust fund my father gave me. That essentially refers to our residence, vehicles, checking and savings accounts, as well as the debts. We divided everything equally. Peggy, that's a really good deal. I think I could have asked for more. Here's the problem, though. I will personally challenge the divorce action if you contest it in any way. See to it that each and every photo that the private investigator in Orlando takes is sent to your parents, siblings, and acquaintances, as well as to any company where you submit an application for employment. Peggy, are you understanding? He remained silent for some while. It was blackmail, this. Brad had made it clear to him and then withdrew from a conversation about what Kyle would do with the inadmissible proof of Peggy's adultery, so he knew it. If Kyle was taken into court on the charge, it wouldn't matter that he was doing it for his kids. Yes, Kyle was aware that it was blackmail, but he had lost all regard for his wife. For sure, she didn't have any for him, and he didn't think he owed her the slightest deference or civility. He was going to use the pictures to manipulate her into giving him what he needed. Legal or not, he would live with what he was doing. Peggy cried so much that she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue until the corners were raw. Finally, she snarled, God, you're a cruel man. I never knew you could do such a thing. I didn't know you could do such a thing as sleep another man for such a petty reason. Peggy, he responded. Cruel. Well, the master told me that. Or maybe the mistress, I suppose. That means I have to thank you for yet another thing. He listened for a response, but all he could hear was sobbing. Anyhow, he said, listen. Regarding visitingation, here is how it will work. Peggy, I don't plan to keep the kids away from you for longer than is absolutely required. To them, I will not do that. What I'll do, Peggy, is insist that you visit the doctor as soon as possible and be tested for every known form of transmission. When I saw the pictures of you sleeping that sob without a condom, I couldn't believe it. Peggy, what in the world were you thinking about? Were you intending to deliver the kids an HIV or something else as a macabre gift? Peggy muttered. He said he didn't have anything. She had given the risks a fleeting thought at the time, but she hadn't considered the potential outcomes. Indeed, Kyle remarked cynically, I bet he did say that. What else could he possibly say? However, what's the deal? Also, he admitted to his wife that he was showing large wigs around. She believed that he was working so hard that, by the time he got home each night, he was utterly worn out. But she didn't voice any complaints. I've heard she didn't enjoy sharing a bed with him. Hollow laughter escaped Kyle's lips. The laughs had no humor in it. How does it feel to have wrecked 2 marriages, Peggy? He inquired. Oh my God. How did you proceed? Peggy, what do you suppose I did? Did you really believe I would let him off the hook? Throughout the entire week, your wedding band was on display. It's evident in almost every photo I have of the garbage and you. He was well aware that you were off bounds as a married woman. Really, do you think I would let someone like that to disrespect our marriage and get away with it? Yeah, right. I apologize, sweetie. What's coming to him will come to him. Peggy, his wife, was actually quite grateful. She was appreciative that we informed her of what he was doing while he was away from her, based on what I've heard from the private investigators. Grab this. Apparently, a few months ago, she saw him having sex with a young lady who was off the streets. Mrs. Lowry claimed that the girl was involved in some very significant drug use. Kyle laughed once again. His tone sounded no more amused than it had the previous time. In actuality, he admitted in a confiding manner, she has been pressuring Om to use condoms. She had been concerned that he could have acquired something. Peggy was unable to speak. As she thought about what her husband was telling her about Harold, the tears stopped. A cold hole started to form in the pit of her stomach. Suddenly she felt queasy. Because she had wished to have slept with that man, she might have died. She isn't going to wait for her dear husband to go out and sleep someone else on her time, said Kyle. Kyle stated in a smug voice, she's dumping him and she's going to take him for every dime he's got. Peggy was unable to reply. She couldn't say anything, and the knot in her throat prevented her from speaking. Well, anyway, when you might have been exposed to HIV, I'm not willing to let you around the kids, he finally concluded. When it comes to my kids, none of that politically correct nonsense matters. Just like that, Peggy, is it understood that you won't be with them till I have the doctor's okay? She nodded, then felt compelled to speak. Yes, she mumbled. Speaking was becoming more and more difficult. That's good, he replied, concluding. Okay, then, Peggy, if you don't fight the divorce, I'll make sure you get to see the kids as often as you want once I have the lab reports in my hand, he informed her. Wait, I forgot, no, please allow me to clarify. HIV symptoms might appear months after exposure. 6 months, maybe, says Doc Miles. Thus, things can proceed if I receive a lab report in 6 months stating that you are clean. Peggy, I don't trust you. The love and respect are gone too, along with everything else. I'll be here to monitor you at all times, but you'll have to come to where we are to see them. But you have that issue. I won't feel sorry for you because you brought this all on yourself. Kyle, the woman muttered. What, Peggy? I apologize, she muttered. Yes, I agree, he replied. All of a sudden, nothing more could be spoken. All right, it makes sense. That must be it for now, he informed her. I'll call back from time to time, he stated, and you can always reach me through Brad's office. He didn't say anything for a while. With a hushed goodbye, he said. She said, goodbye, in a quiet tone. Before she could say anything more, Kyle disconnected. Hello, Peggy, her mother angrily asked. Why didn't you call me when you got home? Peggy exclaimed, Mom, everything is all upside down. She spoke erratically, but she said everything. Her mother asked in a worried voice, why, baby, what's wrong? She barked, what's Kyle done now? It's not what Kyle did, Peggy answered. All right, yes, but that's not the whole story. What are you saying, honey? Tell me what's happening. For the first time, Peggy gave in to her pain and sobbed. Mom, Kyle is divorcing me. What? Denise bellowed. She questioned, who the hell does he think he is? She reassured her daughter, don't worry, baby, we'll make sure he doesn't get away with this. Mom, with hesitation, Peggy spoke. She inhaled deeply. It may be as soon as now, she reasoned. There, I was sharing a bed with a man. In Orlando, and Kyle has captured everything on camera. Her mother didn't say anything for a while. Well, honey, that doesn't matter, Denise finally responded. We're going to overcome this. You don't understand, Mom, Peggy urged. Kyle left me just as I was getting even with him for what happened at the party. He's lost me forever, she muttered. He won't even let me see the kids until I visit the doctor. What? That is not possible for him to do. Denise spoke up. I told you, Mom. He's got movies, photos, and everything, Peggy persisted. He'll spread those around this town if I battle him for the kids. Mother, you'll get your own copy. Would you like to watch your little girl making jokes about strangers? Mother, is that what you want? No, I didn't believe that. Let's face it, Mom, I can't stop him now that I'm in his thrall. I have no idea where he is at all. Denise was unable to respond for a long time. I thought I was so smart, coldly said Peggy. I refused to listen to him and I was going to exact revenge on him for what he had done to Anne. I never did. I was too naive to realize that it was actually an error. And I've lost him now. Her mother hesitated and then responded, well, honey, I don't think you were incorrect in that. You should have been understood by Kyle. He ought to have realized you couldn't allow a man to treat you that way. She stated firmly, if he had been any sort of husband, he would have seen that. You know your dad and I will do all in our power to support you, baby. We'll exact revenge on Kyle. I swear to you that, she uttered. Peggy took a minute to look at the cell phone in shock, holding it away from her ear. Mom, she at last uttered. Why don't you just shut the hell up? She depressed the power button. The lone woman hurled the phone against the distant wall. Seated on the carpeted floor, she stared blindly out the patio door, taking in the full extent of how completely her world had fallen apart. My comment, did you like the ending? Was it something that was different from the past? What would you do if your partner say they are done with you and divorce you? Comment down below, sub and bell, and I will catch you in the next one.